we have the energy flow, right? So as you guys know that sun is the basic source of energy for any ecosystem to operate. Well, with few exceptions like in the ecosystem of deep sea hydrothermal areas, let's forget about that. But leaving those exceptions apart, sun is the basic source of energy for any ecosystem to operate. Okay, so as you guys must be knowing that there is something called PAR, or you can pronounce it as PAR. This is the photosynthetical active radiation. Okay, so as you must be knowing that less than 50% of the sunlight comes under the PAR. Okay, so just for your knowledge, PAR is falls in the wavelength range of 400 to 700 nanometer. Okay, and PAR is nothing but the amount of light available for plants during photosynthesis. So yes, so the PAR is the amount of light available for plants during photosynthesis, which lies in the wavelength range of 400 to 700 nanometer. Well, this PAR is only less than 50% of the sunlight falls in under PAR, and to our surprise, only 2 to 10% of the PAR is utilized by plants. Okay, only 2 to 10% of the PAR is utilized by the plants during photosynthesis, right? So plants are using this PAR. Okay, so what are they doing with this PAR? There have to be something why they are using this sunlight. Obviously, they are using this sunlight to prepare food. So these plants become the autotrophs of our ecosystem, right? These plants become the autotrophs of our ecosystem because they're using this light to prepare food. But there are consumers as well, which are directly or indirectly dependent on autotrophs, directly or indirectly dependent on autotrophs for food, right? So directly they can directly the direct ones can be called as the herbivores, right? Because these herbivores, the directly dependent ones, will be the herbivores, because these are grass eating and plant eating, so they are directly dependent on autotrophs, whereas there are the indirectly dependent ones also, which are the carnivores, because carnivores are not the plant eating ones. Okay, so carnivores food are the herbivores and herbivores food are the autotrophs. So you can say in a way that the carnivores are indirectly dependent on the autotrophs because they are dependent on the herbivores and herbivores are dependent on the autotrophs. That's why carnivores are indirectly dependent on the autotrophs. So the interaction of these autotrophs with the consumers is what makes the food chain. Okay, so here I am using a new term which is the food chain. I'm writing it over here. Okay, so these autotrophs and consumers make up the food chain. So what is a food chain? A food chain is a linear network of organisms in which energy is trapped and passed from one organism to the other. So what am I saying? That food chain is nothing but a linear network of organisms in which energy is being trapped and passed from one organism to the other. So if I get to make a food chain, I can say, let's take an example. Okay, so this is grass. Okay, well, the deer is dependent on the grass for food. Okay, and the lion is dependent on the deer for food. So here I make a food chain, and as you can very well see, it is linear in nature. Okay, it's linear in shape. That's why I've called food chain a linear network of organisms, right? So I'll say that the grass is the producer, right? Because it was the autotroph. The deer is the primary consumer. I'm calling it as primary because it was directly depending on the autotroph for food. And I call the lion the secondary consumer. Okay, because it was indirectly depending on the grass, and because it's the secondary one as a consumer, so I call it a secondary consumer. Well, there are even examples when we come for a fourth trophic level, which we call the tertiary consumer. Like we can take the example of phytoplankton, zooplankton, fish, man. So here the phytoplankton becomes our producer, the zooplankton becomes our primary consumer, the fish becomes our secondary consumer, and the man becomes our tertiary consumer. Okay. So the levels or the stages of a food chain or levels of the food chain are called trophic level. So if you're asked what is a trophic level, then you can easily define that a trophic level is a stage or a level of a food chain. Okay, so here we can see that this is a lower trophic level and the TC is the higher trophic level. Okay, so these are these trophic levels. Uh, but there is a restriction on the number of trophic levels, and it is because there is a law which is being followed in the nature, which is known as the 10% law. And according to this 10% law, whatever energy, the amount of energy that will be passed from one trophic level to a higher trophic level will only be 10% of the previous one's energy. Okay, so there cannot be an infinite amount of energy, right? There would be a certain amount of energy, which is why we are restricted on the number of our trophic levels. So you can write down, and this is very, very important. It's often asked in your board exams, what is the 10% law? The 10% law, okay? 10% law states that the amount of energy passed on from one trophic level to a greater or a higher trophic level is 10% of the previous trophic levels energy. Okay, so whatever was the amount of energy in the first trophic level, the second trophic level will only have 10% of it. Okay, and same would be the case for the the secondary consumer one. For the secondary consumer, it will only have the 10% of the primary consumer one's energy, and the tertiary consumer one will have the least energy, because it will have 10% of what secondary consumer has. Okay, so this was a 10% law, and let me just define what is a standing crop. Okay, so it is this is also an important term, that the standing crop is the amount of biomass or organic matter present in an area. Okay, so this is a standing crop, which says it is the amount of biomass or organic matter present in an area. Okay, so standing crop is really easy. So as I was talking about the 10% law, if someone asks you why is the number of trophic levels restricted in a food chain, it is because the nature follows the 10% law. The ecosystem follows the 10% law, which states that the amount of energy passed on from one trophic level to a greater or higher trophic level is only 10% of the previous trophic level's energy. Okay, so this is all under energy flow.